Good evening, everyone. My name is Sean, and I'm a stress specialist, behavioral specialist, and dealing in stress, and obviously a logotherapist, which I'm very proud to be as well. And all the work that I do, I always talk about the principles of Viktor Frankl and the principles of meaning that he has in our lives. Tonight is a special lecture which is about the pluralistic framework of meaning and perplexity, with integrating perplexity with the rejection of meaning in suffering. So we're going to start on the following. Human beings are deeply orientated toward meaning. Across philosophy, religion, and psychology, the assumption has often been that suffering can be interpreted in ways that restore coherence to life. One of the most influential articulations of this position comes from Viktor Frankl, whose work in logotherapy proposed that even under extreme conditions, meaning can be discovered without suffering. Frankl's work has helped millions of people find strength in the face of adversity. However, an important question remains: is the meaning in suffering universal? Or are these circumstances in which suffering resists meaning altogether? This lecture explores that question. The traditional framework is meaning in suffering. Frankl proposed that suffering can become meaningful when it is integrated into a person's moral or existential narrative. Under this framework, suffering may produce growth, transformation, courage, spiritual insight, moral responsibility. For many individuals, this interpretation becomes deeply overpowering. A person facing illness, trauma, or loss may discover meaning through how they respond to the experience. This remains one of the most powerful ideas in existential psychology. But human experience reveals something more complex. Not every individual encounters suffering in the same way. The limits of meaning. Certain experiences appear to challenge the assumption that suffering always contains meaning. Severe illness, traumatic injustice, sudden bereavement, prolonged decline. In such circumstances, individuals may search for meaning, yet find that existing explanations fail to correspond with their lived experience. Attempts to frame the suffering as purposeful may feel forced or morally intrusive. This is where a different existential state emerges, a state that precedes interpretation itself. The threshold of meaning, perplexity. Perplexity describes the moment when the frameworks used to interpret suffering begin to collapse. It does not represent confusion. It represents the recognition that the available explanations no longer correspond with reality. The individual stands at the threshold where meaning-seeking encounters its limits. At this point, the person must decide how to interpret the experience. Perplexity, therefore, becomes the landscape in which existential responses emerge. The pluralistic framework. Once perplexity appears, several pathways become possible. One pathway remains the one described by Frankl. Some individuals discover meaning within suffering itself. Other pathways appear where meaning is preserved, but not attributed to the suffering. The individual continues to find meaning through relationships, responsibilities, love, and memory. Meaning survives, but exists outside the suffering. A third pathway is the rejection of meaning in suffering. In this response, the individual concludes that the suffering itself contains no meaning. This does not necessarily imply nihilism. The person must still value relationships and life itself, but the suffering is not interpreted as purposeful. These responses demonstrate the human reactions to suffering are pluralistic rather than uniform. The preservation of human dignity. At the center of this framework lies a simple ethical principle. Human dignity does not depend on transforming suffering into meaning. Dignity can also reside in honesty. Some individuals discover meaning in suffering. Some discover meaning outside suffering. Some conclude that suffering contains no meaning. Each position reflects a legitimate human response. Perplexity simply names the landscape in which these responsibilities emerge. Perplexity does not destroy meaning. It reveals the limits of explanation. Within this space, individuals remain free to interpret their experiences in different ways. Meaning becomes a possibility, not an obligation. And in that freedom, human dignity remains intact. And I'm going to share my slides. The pluralistic framework of meaning and perplexity, understanding different responses to suffering. And this is what I speak about. We then have the pluralistic framework of meaning and perplexity, existential responses to suffering. On the left-hand side, we have meaning in suffering, which I spoke about growth, transformation, purpose found. On the right-hand side, the meaning out relationships, love, and commitment. Meaning in suffering, again, talking about that. Perplexity in the middle, existential responses in suffering. Rejection and meaning in suffering. Unexplained, no purpose, autonomy. Frankel's insight and his influence. Logotherapy asserts the search for meaning as a primary human motivation, meaning discovered through creative contribution, love and encounter, attitude towards suffering under constraints. Frankel shows that life retains meaning even amongst extreme hardship. Meaning from possibility to expectation. Drifting logotherapy can turn suffering can have meaning into suffering must have meaning. Imposing the demand for meaning risks moralizing suffering. Some suffering, such as advanced illness or severe trauma, may not lend itself to meaning. Not every wound yields a gift or lesson. Not all suffering yields meaning. Advanced illness, complex trauma, existential exhaustion. In many cases, pain defines justification or hidden gifts. Respecting responses to suffering. A pluralistic approach honors different existential responses, finding meaning in suffering, finding meaning outside of suffering, and rejecting. Meaning should not be imposed. In perplexity, when suffering defies explanation, meaning cannot always be found in suffering, may resist explanation altogether. And as I show there, meaning seeking hits limits, narratives break down, value in relationships remains, support replaces explanation, open-mindedness, humility, restraint, and honesty. Who decides the meaning of suffering? Whose authority prevails when facing suffering? Practitioner, individual. Respect for autonomy affirms the patient's right to their own way of thinking and feeling. And respecting human dignity in suffering. Frankel's insight continues to inspire, yet some patients find meaning within suffering. Others find integrity in rejecting meaning as an interpretive requirement. Dignity includes the right to decline meaning. And the existential pathways, human responses to suffering. And I've just given a slide here which explains all of these things in a more understanding type situation. And I'm willing to share this with you, Pan and Mark, if you would like the slide. It might be one that needs to be studied a bit more. I spent quite a bit of time researching this, and this is what I came up with. And if we look at not failure, a legitimate human state of respect, presence, dignity, truth, and life continues. The insight to choose over explanation, dignity without resolution, truth without justification, life continues even when meaning is unclear. And then we have existential divergence. Mark, I asked you please if you could comment on this particular slide relating to Ian Flaherty and Eric Dane. Mark?
Right. So some of you might have followed the story of Ian Flaherty. So Ian Flaherty was a colleague of mine when I was in the theatre industry. He was a very well-known performer, television presenter, a producer, writer, musician. He was really a fantastic all-rounder, immense talent, immense charm. Created a very successful career for himself. And about 6 months ago, he suddenly started popping up on Facebook and YouTube, presenting a series which he called, uh, it was around what he calls self-deliverance. And he basically, what he was proposing was putting forward the hypothesis that we each have the right to decide about when our lives should end. And he started off by the first two episodes were about his parents, his mother and his father, both of whom had really difficult endings to their life. They both had Alzheimer's. They both died. after long periods of suffering which also extended to the family on various levels, financial, emotional, spiritual, etc. Um, and everybody kind of wondered where this was going, and we thought, yeah, he's making a case for euthanasia, the right to end a life which is no longer meaningful or purposeful or bearable, perhaps because of extreme pain, etc. But it soon became clear that that wasn't actually what he was advocating for. What he was talking about was a term which he called self-deliverance, and he was very careful to differentiate between what he called self-deliverance and suicide. Self-deliverance in to him was the right to be able to decide the time and manner of one's own death. Now, Ian was 61 years old. He was in perfect health. He was a good-looking, robust, fit man, but he had decided that he did not want to get old and that he was going to become a burden on his children and the rest of his family. Being in the theatre industry, work had dried up for him, and he'd also reached a point where he had, the theatre is a difficult way of life, and he'd reached a point where he just didn't have the motivation, the energy. He couldn't find the meaning in his work any longer. He couldn't see himself producing another show, writing another show, getting up on stage again, which is something which I can relate to. I went through a similar feeling in my own career in the theatre, which is partly what led to my shift to doing what I do now. So what then became apparent was that he was informing the world of his decision to end his own life sooner rather than later. And of course, this evolved into a huge amount of discussion and argument and debate on social media. Obviously, there was a lot of religious debate around the thing, only God has the right to take life. Ian himself was an atheist, and he made it very clear in his presentations that he would not be entering into debates of a religious nature because it was not relevant or pertinent to his life or death. And then, of course, there were people going, that's fine. If this is your choice, um, that's fine. Go ahead and do it. But why do you have to make it so public? Why are you making a big song and dance about it? And of course, there was a lot of talk about Ever the Showman. This is his last production that he's presenting before he ends his life. Um, and then, of course, there was the issue of his family. And in one episode, um, he spoke about he called the series Dying for a Better Life. And in a very controversial and quite triggering for me episode, he spoke about when he sat his family down and told them of his decision. Now, there's a bit of history here and context, which is very important. Ian and his she was his ex-wife by the end of his life, but they remained close friends. They had two children when they were first married, both of whom suffered from a very severe disease for which there was very little cure. And because he was in the public eye, obviously their battle to help their children to survive became very public. They raised millions of rands through making public requests for contributions, and they were able to take both children, Oscar and Valeska, over to the UK for the treatment which they needed. Unfortunately, Valeska didn't survive. She died, I think, when she was about 10 years old. But Oscar, the son, has now made it into adulthood. He is around 30 years old now. Um, he has dwarfism and multiple other conditions, but it looks like he's going to lead a fairly normal life expectancy, albeit with a lot of challenges along the way. So a lot of the questioning was around, you found such meaning in in prolonging and saving the lives of your children, and now when there's nothing wrong with you, you're wanting to end your own life. They then went on to have another child who didn't have the physical problems that Oscar and Valeska had, and she recently got married. But when he told them of his plans, they were devastated. But this didn't sway him at all. He maintains that he managed to, on some level, convince them of that that this was important to him and meaningful to him. But the fact remains that after his death, which was kept from the public for about a week, they only announced his death a week after it happened, which was about a month ago now. Um, and the implication in the messages from the family that they were suffering a great deal and asked for the respect to be allowed to grieve in peace and away from the public eye, which often happens with people who are in the public eye. Of course, the argument here also became, I mean, in one of the episodes, Ian actually said, my family's getting a lot of flack. Please allow them, to grieve in peace. And of course, the response to that was, well, you're the one who's put your whole life and your whole family's life out into the public domain. Now you're asking for yourself and them to be given privacy. So it was very controversial. And of course, for us as logotherapists, this brought up a lot of questions for me, and I raised the issue one night in one of our supervisors' meetings. We as logotherapists who are advocating for their life being meaningful right up until the end, until the end. Where do we stand on an issue like this? Somebody deciding to take their own life in the full bloom of that life when they are still healthy, but going, I don't want to get old. I can't earn money. I don't want to be a burden on anybody. Therefore, I want to die at a point when I'm healthy, happy. Do I have the right to make that choice? So that was really the story of Ian, and then Sean came back with the story of Eric Dane, which was um, exactly the opposite, where he persisted in finding meaning in the real suffering that he was going through at the end of his life. And the argument was, towards Ian, you're not suffering as such, apart from the fact that you're not earning much of an income. And what about, there was a lot of whataboutness, of course, going on here. What about people who are dying and would give anything for another day, another week, another 6 months, another year? And yet here you are as a perfectly healthy man of only 61, making the decision to end your life. So it is a hugely, hugely controversial subject, and one with as many opinions, I think, as there are humans. And I think, partly in some ways, what has led to this is Sean's decision to give this presentation, because it does pose very, very many questions for us as logotherapists and where we stand. And I think also, a question which is posed by Sean's presentation is, are we as logotherapy practitioners, are we bound to say to every single person who comes to us, there is meaning to be found in suffering? And Sean is saying, but what about the person who's not able to find that meaning or rejects the idea of meaning in suffering? Do we have to, not blindly follow the dictates and tenets of logotherapy, but how do we accommodate people who are not willing or able to go down the path that logotherapy advocates? Thanks, Sean. Back to you.
Thank you so much, Mark. I know how much that meant to you and how many questions are asked, being so close. On the other end of Eric Dane, who passed as a result of ALS, was very close to my heart because my daughter-in-law's mother passed away from ALS and battling ALS the same as Eric Dane did. And she did give up near the end, unfortunately, whereas Eric Dane suffered from ALS, didn't want to. And out of interest, ALS is only 13,000 patients in the whole of America that suffer from this very rare disease. So that was my personal like of Eric Dane. And there's some beautiful stuff that he talks about in his interview that he did before he passed. I'm going to continue now to the next slide. And it's about the three human responses to suffering. We have meaning creation, finding purpose in suffering, growth and inspiration and transcendence, which is meaning creation. We have meaning rejection, loss of control, despair and withdrawal, is existential closure, which is meaning rejection. And meaning transformation, adapt and change, resilience and insight, and newfound meaning. And meaning transformation. Some suffering cannot be explained. Perplexity means admitting this truth without fabricating false meaning. And I'm going to end off and say to you the following, and I'm going to pick up, Mark, on where you kind of led us to and where we went on. And that's about the clinical implications. And this is my proposal. Recognizing this pluralistic framework has important implications for clinical practice. Where meaning is assumed to exist in every instance of suffering, individuals may feel pressured to interpret the experience in ways that do not feel authentic. A pluralistic model allows a different posture. The practitioner does not prescribe meaning. Instead, the practitioner respects the individual's existential interpretation. The task becomes an accomplishment rather than an explanation. Thank you so much.
Thank you,
Over to you.
Sean. Well, a lot of food for thought there. Would anybody like to comment on what Sean has shared with us? Have questions for him? I think I've said enough for the moment. I'd like to hear from some other people. Any thoughts, ideas, questions, challenges for Sean? Um, I know that he's very open to, debating this question and, how do we feel about it as logotherapy practitioners? And as I said at the beginning of the session, I think it's important that we're constantly challenging ourselves and questioning the validity of what we're doing, how we're doing it, where it is applicable, where it may not be. Viktor Frankl says to us, if we treat as logotherapy therapists, if we treat two clients in the same way, we're treating at least one of them wrong. And that must surely extend to the client who goes, no, I'm not able to find meaning in this particular suffering. It feels just like suffering and nothing more. What do we do with that client?
Sean, can you hear me? So,
And you, Coral?
for me, what is interesting in the von Mehmeti example is how do you weigh up freedom of choice against meaning to the end? They kind of feel as if they're conflicting with each other in a way.
It's a very interesting concept, and I'm busy researching as always, trying to get a little deeper in terms of what actually happens with the brain. And the brain kind of switches off to a certain extent. And I'm yet to unpack, and I'm busy unpacking the neurobiological side of it. It's like a conscious depression, for want of a better word. It's being conscious of your depression, and it does affect neural pathways. For example, the dopamine pathway is affected, dopamine neurotransmitter of about reward and about the good things. And it's an interesting concept, Coral, and it's something that I'm busy researching, and I will come back and explain it a bit more. It's also what happens with PTSD very often. One of the hostages that survived the October the 7th and was returned actually committed suicide because they were so depressed about the situation. They had survivor's guilt. And I think that is another aspect that we often have to consider is survivor's guilt. And maybe if Vanamity had a kind of survivor's guilt about it, which he never really spoke about, and Mark, I haven't really unpacked that, but it's a huge, huge phenomenon related to PTSD, and especially soldiers who come out of war areas suffering from that, is that survivor's guilt. Why did they survive? And why were others killed? Or why were you maimed and not killed? All these kind of things that come about in terms of that extreme depression. We call it post-traumatic stress, and I don't call it post-traumatic stress. I say that it's trauma that has been in different ways of being experienced by the individual, and it very much relates to the environment. So, as Mark alluded, in terms of the entertainment industry, for example, it is a very rock and roll type stability, sustainability industry. And I think those people are very vulnerable to it. If we take actors in general, Mark, there's a facade. There's always a story behind an actor in terms of what he's really going through and how he's able to act it out. So it's all related to personality traits as well. And it's also a very interesting facet. So to answer your question, I am still trying to go deep into neurobiology, but these are my initial thoughts to try and answer your question in the best way that I can. I don't know if that helps you in some way.
I'm just thinking that logotherapy might have to come after dealing with neural pathways. I don't know anything about neural pathways, but I'm trying to understand from you that are you saying that neural pathways could transcend or come or negate the effects of logotherapy, which says that there's meaning right up to and including the end, or is the act of self-deliverance itself part of the meaning that he might have received or got from ending it in the way that he did? I know it's a very...
No. Cora, I think here is the divide, as I call it, and the divider between science, which I talk about, and philosophy. And I think we need to really clearly understand that we don't confuse the two of science and philosophy. So I'm looking at it more on the scientific level, on a biological level, and I'm also looking at various other aspects. Whereas logotherapy is a philosophy in terms of emotions. So I'm talking about an aspect of science. So I'm not negating what you're saying about philosophy and emotions related to that in stress. So that's where I'm going with this. So your track is 100% perfect. I'm trying to look at the scientific aspect related to that. I've been writing a very long paper about the inhumane mind relating to why people kill, why people commit violent crimes, that type of thing. And it's so interesting that the science and the philosophy are two different aspects which actually join together. So I will do that for a next time. Thanks, Coral.
Wonderful. Thanks, Sean.
Hi, Sean. Jean here. I'd like to pose a question because I think it's important. What about you as a therapist and your ethical responsibility when you do have a client that comes to you and say they are planning this? As far as I know, ethical responsibility says you have to contact one of the authorities. That's not something you can keep to yourself. Otherwise, you are implicated in the process. Is this something you have any knowledge of, or how would you handle it if you saw a client, Mark, maybe, that has this conundrum?
Okay, it's not a conundrum. It's exactly what you say. In terms of my letter of consent, before I engage with a client, I get them to sign it off. And one of the clauses there states that exactly, that should this be the case, I have an obligation to report it. So absolutely, you're spot on, Jean, 100%. It's in my letter of consent. If anybody wants a copy of it, you're more than welcome to ask me for a copy of that letter of consent, which clearly states that, and they sign off on that. Does that help?
Yes, I would like. Yeah, it helps me a lot, and I'd like a copy of your letter. I'll send you an email.
Well, can we do this then? Pan, can I send you the letter? And whoever would like to get a copy of it, not only from tonight's presentation, but in terms of answering this question, Pan, that might help you in terms of going forward.
If I could just come in here on the question of ethics. So Jean, there was something really interesting that happened. I'm sure a lot of you will know who the journalist Marianne Tam is. And after once Ian had ended his life, she did she wrote a fascinating article, an analysis of the situation in which she said all the people on Facebook and social media who were encouraging and saying, well done, Ian, for taking a stand about this, and showing us that we can take responsibility for our own lives and deaths in this way, she was saying, are those people not legally actually putting themselves in a really position, almost in terms of an accessory of aiding and abetting the death? She even likened it in some ways to the people who stand at the bottom of a building where somebody is about and shouting, jump, jump, jump. And that raised obviously a whole lot of other interesting debate, and of course a lot of the argument in Ian about why it was important that it was on social media, what it was, that it was about opening up the argument, bringing a subject out into the open that is really taboo, and all that kind of thing. Sean, if I may, this is maybe a little bit off the topic of what your talk was about, but in relation to logotherapy and neuroscience. So, for example, so we've got existential analysis, okay? And so we've got a client who is battling with a meaning crisis. We do logotherapy, we elicit the will to meaning, we engage with the creative, experiential, and attitudinal values. And maybe what we realize is that there needs to be some kind of attitude modulation. Now, very often what happens, I find, in logotherapy is that you can have all this philosophical, existential discussion, but when it gets to the how do I achieve an attitude modulation? Does neuroscience then not have a part to play? Because obviously, a shifting in attitude is the way we think about something. And does neuroscience not provide us with a tool of being able to say, let us open a new neural pathway in relation to how you think about this particular subject? So what I'm saying is there a good marriage between logotherapy and neuroscience, in which neuroscience provides a practical tool for manifesting the meaning and purpose that one has discovered? How do you translate that into something practical in your life?
Absolutely, there is. So let me change the word from neuroscience to neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity is exactly that. And that's a subject which I am passionate about. I belong to a specific society relating to neuroplasticity. I am a neuroplastician, for want of a better word. So neuroplasticity is most definitely the way to do that. And there are coaching methods which are very similar to logotherapy. And what we're going to be encountering is terms of coaching or training the brain to recalibrate. So I use the word recalibration, recalibration, because I think that most people understand that a bit more than what is neuroplasticity. It's brain recalibration. And that's definitely what happens. It involves all the neurotransmitters. It's the recalibration of all the neurotransmitters. So most definitely there is. One of the things I just want to put out there in terms of something that I found very interesting, I think I've spoken about once before, are my principles of life, which is acknowledge that it's happened, accept that it's happened. Your attitude towards that, in other words, your attitude is good or bad or indifferent, your habits of how you're going to change or you don't want to change, and of course, gratitude. So those are the four principles of life of which I've encapsulated. And based on that, it does tie in with brain recalibration of the acknowledgement of something in terms of the acceptance, and the breathing aspects of the physiological aspects of dealing with it. You know, we always talk about the psychological aspects. What about the physiological aspects? You know, for example, if we have doctors who are under a lot of stress, how do they deal with their stress? Their stress is also, they have heart attacks as well, because it affects the physiological aspect, and we call psychoneuroimmunology. And then we have the emotional, which is us, and of course the emotional other aspects, and spiritual, of the human spirit. So it's all intertwined and connected, Mark, in terms of the rephrase, neuroplasticity, brain recalibration, and most definitely there is. I hope that answers your question.
Sean, it's Denise Jacob here. I would just like to know, have you ever considered what the the value of the polyvagal theory is regard to the rejection of meaning?
Well, as we know Davina, the polyvagal theory is most definitely part of the practice of neuroplasticity. There's no question about that whatsoever. In fact, and now I'm going to throw something at you. I don't know if you've seen the latest rejection of the polyvagal theory in terms of they're saying, but it's not actually perfect and what should be. So absolutely, the vagus nerve is so very important, and the whole sympathetic nervous system is so very important. So, Davina, you know a lot about this, and I'm saying, and my answer is a quick yes, most definitely. It has an enormous effect on it, and I'm sure you would agree with me.
Yes, it's just that, you know, when we are in that fight or flight response, then your prefrontal cortex or the functioning of your executive brain is not on par. And, you know, my feeling of meaning is that we need some form of metacognition. And when you are stressed or when you are depressed or when you are in trauma, that is absolutely undermined. And it's difficult then to go and find meaning when you can't even think straight.
100%, Davina. We're actually talking about the HPA axis. So the HPA axis is the most important part of this, and this is what we then do in terms of the polyvagal theory related to the HPA axis. So the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala, especially, which is the stress response relating to flight, and freeze. I think the biggest problem is the freeze part. And it could be, and I'm just speculating here, that maybe the neural connections of anonymity could have been related to the freeze response subconsciously. That he'd shut down the neural pathways of activity. In other words, the neuroplastic neural pathways or the RAIN pre-calibration pathways are somewhat burnt out and they were not wiring. So that's kind of my take, Davina.
Thank you.
Pan, I can't see Mark. Is he around? Robert, is Mark around?
His computer has just crashed. I left a message there, and he's going to try and join us as soon as he
Okay,
can.
great. All right, thank you. Thank
Okay.
you so much. Okay, any other questions or comments? I think this is a great and important subject, and one that I'm hoping that we can visit again, or we can help to do this. Anybody with experience relating to coming across a case or a patient or client that you've come across that struggles with finding meaning. Hi, Karen, I can hear you.
Great. Okay, I wasn't at the beginning of the presentation, but I just wanted to share something with you that happened to me last year. My tenant, who I have known more than 20 years, committed suicide. And because I knew him so well, people were coming and say, "Oh, Shane, you know, so sad, so this, so that, so the next thing, but, you know, but he didn't reach out, etc., etc." But when I think about it, almost from a logotherapy point of view, there was almost, he chose to leave this world in a way that he wanted. He was becoming very ill. He was not able to work. He had just crashed his car again. Phone had broken. He literally was below the bottom. And he always said to me that he would not become a burden to anybody. I mean, yes, he was a stubborn fool, and I love him to bits. But looking at it from his perspective, I think he went the way that he wanted to go on his terms, and there was absolutely nothing anybody could have said to him that it would have changed his situation. So I just yes, it's sad he's gone, but I don't feel sad or that he went the way he did. If you understand what I'm saying, I just feel sometimes it's a bit kinder, when the animal is suffering, so we take a decision, and sometimes humans need to take that decision too. I don't know, that's in this situation, that's how I feel.
Thank you for sharing that, Karen. I think the part here that comes to mind is my principles of life, of acknowledge, accept, attitude, and gratitude. And I think that you've summed up all four of those in terms of what it is. And we cannot be prescriptive about if a person wants to continue or not continue their life. We can put out a hand, but if they don't hold the hand or capture the hand and they fall away, well, there's nothing much we can do about it. Everybody has a choice, like you say, the freedom of will. So yes, it is what it is there, and it affects people in different ways. Yeah, sometimes we just have to say, well, it is what it is.
And
Or
for
this
me,
too
it's
shall
about
pass.
respecting that decision. That's what I also want to say, that I respect him for that.
Right,
I'm not going to judge him for it. I'm going to respect him.
right. Great, thanks for sharing. I really appreciate it. I've got an interesting a chat here. It's from Irene, and she says, "I'm currently busy with my studies in multi-level neuroprocessing, and have started combining this approach with my logotherapy training inspired by Viktor Frankl. This integration allows me to bring together brain-based techniques and a focus on meaning and purpose to support holistic personal development." So thank you very much for thanking me for my session, Irene. I mean, this is really, really amazing. I'm hoping that perhaps you'd like to do a presentation at some time about this as a follow-up. Irene, if you can hear me, can you answer?
I did hear you, and yeah, I'll work with that with my trainers to build up the courage to come and do that. Thank you so much for mentioning that.
Thank you so much, Irene. Pardon me, I think there's so many tentacles related to this, and I think that we can certainly continue this discussion. Mark, I think there's so many various facets of it. So yeah, maybe for another time down the road, we have some other beautiful presentations coming up. Anybody else? Mark, any comments from you? You disappeared for a while. All right. Anybody else would like to say something? Grant, thank you. I do acknowledge what you said. Thank you so much. You dropped one of the first chats. I do appreciate that. Mark, from your, I beg your pardon, Grant, from your experience, have you had any cases of this, especially in your modality?
Yes, I have. I've had people who don't want to accept, and it's through spending time. And that's where I think the neuroplasticity comes in. Spending time with them and them actually getting to realize that they can do things and learning to do things and learning to live again. Uh, that also aids them in finding meaning. That's what I found.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.
Sean and Mark.
Yes.
Hi,
Just a question from my side.
I've
Hi,
just joined
Sean
from my
again.
phone.
Okay. What I'd like to ask is, I think we should do a session on the responsibility of the therapist and the steps they take if they do find either that their client is severely depressed, has psychological issues, planning suicide. I think those ethical responsibilities, we need to discuss that at a stage.
John, that's a great point. In fact, I do have a protocol that I can certainly do. It is a general therapist protocol, which I can put up as a VFISA protocol. Mark, if you're happy with that,
Yeah, that would be great.
I can do that. Carry on, Mark.
We do cover. Sorry, I've joined from my phone now. Can you now see and hear me? I think, Jean, that is supposed to be covered in the advanced course. Did you, or even one of the courses, foundation or advanced, did you not cover ethics at any point?
Ethics was covered, but not in real life situations.
Right.
Where we have an example of, sorry, I'm in my car with my dog, where you have where you have a case or a client where you are actually facing these phenomena.
Mm-hmm.
How to react, how to respond, what to do next.
I think what you're raising here is something very important, and maybe it's not only about ethics, but that we perhaps need to have a kind of one of these discussions where it's a forum for people to ask about real life situations and what you do. So not only in relation to ethics, but any questions that come up for you in terms of what do I do in a situation like this. I think it would be very good for us to set up a forum where we have as many of the supervisors present as possible, where we can discuss as many of those issues as possible. It could potentially even be a series that we do. So let's have a look into that. I think it would be valuable. Thanks for bringing that up, Sean. What I was trying to say when I was when you couldn't hear me, and you know, obviously I was absent from the meeting for a few minutes. So if this issue has been brought up, please stop me. But meaning and purpose are probably two of the most important words and related to logotherapy. But the other one I think is responsibility or responsibleness. And back to the Ian story, for a long time, while the series was ongoing and while he was still alive, I really battled to define what my stance towards the whole situation was. And it was only after he'd passed away that I got some clarity, and that clarity came through my daughter, who has got a wonderful sense of humor. And I'd been keeping her up to speed on what had been happening. And I said to her, you know, Ian has passed away. And she's the master of the pithy comment. And she said to me, Daddy, if you ever did anything like that to me, I would go no contact with you in the afterlife. Apart from the humorousness of the situation, of her comment, what I took on board was, if you ever did that to me, not if you ever did that to me, ever did that to yourself. And the question that raised in me was, yes, so we have the right to make a choice for ourselves, but what happens in the instance where making a choice for ourselves automatically makes a choice for other people too? So by choosing to do that, Ian has made a choice for his family that they are going to have to deal with loss, grief, and perhaps a very complicated kind of grief and loss because of the way he had chosen to end his life. Do we have the right in making a choice for ourselves to follow through with that choice if that choice also makes choices for other people's lives and they are not necessarily in agreement with that, or do not want to have that choice made for them? So there's another whole moral debate, which I think, you know, what Ian did opens up. I don't know if anyone agrees or disagrees.
Well, you know, in dealing with a counselor for suicide, and a lot of this comes in terms of how do we deal with it. So it's really a discussion, which is I can do at any time, is how do we deal with suicide, and how do we deal with suicide from a logotherapy point of view. So I'm more than willing to share a whole lecture related to suicide, which will accommodate some of the questions that you have and trying to find some answers to that, because it does all relate to suicide.
Yeah, I would be very into that. I currently have, I think, 3 or 4 clients whose family members, spouses, or children have committed suicide, and you know, my response is that they're dealing with a type of grief that is, you know, has a lot of guilt very often associated with it. Obviously, everybody's grief situation is different, but so often the people left behind after suicide, there's, did I do enough? Why didn't I stop them? Or did I love them enough? Did they love me enough? There are all of those complex things which arise. And, you know, even though Ian maintains that he sat them down and explained it all very carefully, we have no way of knowing how anybody is going to grieve. And I don't think we can ever say, well, I've prepared my children or my family, 20 years down the line, something could come up, So I don't think we can say, I've dealt with the issue of my family's grief. No, you haven't, because you do not know how they are going to grieve, because you are not them. So that was for me the big sticking point of Ian's choice, was that it wasn't only a choice for him. He was making a choice for a whole bunch of people, including an entire industry, which is mourning his loss in various ways, whether, accepting of what he did or not.
Well, that's exactly what happens with suicide, is those who leave behind. How are they going to deal with it? Are they prepared? Are they unprepared? Is it sudden? Is it not sudden? You had Karen earlier who was talking on the phone in her car about a friend of hers or a colleague of hers, a friend of hers, I beg your pardon, who had in fact death by suicide. So, those are really serious questions that we keep on answering. But when this situation actually happens, I think we are unprepared, and we start grappling for questions. So I think it's always to be mindful. We say we were taught CPR, but all of a sudden, when we have to enact it or do it, we forget what we were taught. So I think that these are the situations we have to constantly have on our minds in terms of a refresher, in terms of how to deal with this, Mark, just like CPR. So maybe we need to have some kind of refreshers, another discussion in a year's time, for example, about this.
Yeah, I think what your wonderful presentation has brought up more than anything is back into focus again, how much we have to keep looking at what we do, how we're doing it, reminding ourselves that we cannot fall into patterns and one size fits all solutions and diagnoses and solutions and even meanings. And that we, because again, logotherapy being such an improvisational form of counseling and therapy, that we have to constantly be open to the meaning of the moment and really open to what the client needs from us, even though they may not necessarily know themselves what it is that they need. And that requires constant, I think, reinvention, constant, reminting of the moment. We can never allow ourselves to fall into established patterns of behavior and response. And this has been such a wonderful reminder of that. And, just how many times we've said this evening, gosh, let's do let's do a talk about this, or let's do that, the constant reminder of how much we need to keep revisiting so many of the issues that we face on a daily basis.
Thank you, Mark. If you want to end off, I just want to say thank you very much to Mark and to everyone on the call. I really do appreciate this opportunity. And I'm more than willing to answer any questions or whatever you want. Please feel free to engage with me. I love engagement, so please feel free. Pan, I'll remember to send you that consent form just as a help, and anything that helps. And let's keep on growing. Let's sustainability, and keep on asking the question why. Thanks, Mark.
Thanks, Sean. Thank you for a really provocative and interesting and thought-provoking presentation. I think I'm probably going to be sending you a bunch of questions in the next few days, as we all, I'm sure many of us will be, as we process everything that we've discussed this evening. Thanks, everybody, for attending and for your participation, and thanks for there being such a good turnout. And next month, it's my turn, actually. I'll be doing a presentation on atheism and the unconscious God towards the end of April. So hope to see you then. Thanks, everybody, and good night.
Good night.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you. Thanks, Sean.